All right, if you have a Bible, go ahead and open up to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. We're excited. I'm excited. These last couple of chapters have been some fun chapters, covering some interesting topics. This is one of the things I love about just studying through books of the Bible. For those of you who are long-timers here, you know that we are what is called an expositional church. We just preach through books of the Bible, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. I'm convinced that chapter 7, at least some of the verses, are verses that if you weren't an expositional church, you would probably skip right over because they're kind of challenging. And there's some interpretive challenges, but also they're just topics that we don't always love to talk about. And so this is a long chapter. It's got a lot of great stuff in it, but it is a little bit of a challenge to tackle. It talks about singleness and sex and divorce and other things that we're going to see as we walk through it. And if you remember, I told you early on in this study that this first letter to the Corinthians from the Apostle Paul is not so much a composed work of theology like the book of Romans, which we're studying on Sunday mornings, is. It's kind of a theological treatise, so to speak. This is actually more of Paul kind of answering a bunch of questions that the Corinthians were asking, addressing a lot of problems that the church was facing. And you see that right here in chapter 7, verse 1. Look at how he opens this chapter. He says, "Now concerning the matters about which you wrote." He says, "It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman," right? So we just came out of chapter 6, and if you were here with us last week, I told you that sex was a gift from God, that it's a good thing, that the church sometimes gets kind of this bad reputation as being, anti-sex, and that's actually not true at all. Actually, we believe that sex is an incredible gift from God, and that because it's such a great gift, because it's such a powerful gift, we just believe that it's given to us to be done within the confines of marriage. And so you come out of chapter 6 seeing Paul lay out this argument for sex and sexuality and marriage specifically. And then he comes right into chapter 7, verse 1, and he says, you wrote to me, it's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Well, what's happening here? Well, obviously what is happening is the Corinthians had sent some questions to Paul. So maybe they had written a letter, or maybe they had sent a messenger that had some things that they wanted Paul to address. So he says, "Now concerning the matters about which you wrote." So he's responding to a question or an issue that they had brought up, that they had wanted him to address. This part in quotes, and we saw this last week in chapter 6, this part in quotes is their statement. And he's going to respond to it just like he did in chapter 6. Now, in chapter 6, what was in quotes was wasn't necessarily one of their statements, but it was like a statement of the day, a saying of the day. And so some people in chapter 6 have confused those quotations as Paul saying, approving of the statement. That's not actually what was happening. It's like I told you last week, it would be like me saying, the statement, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Well, just because I say the statement in quotes doesn't mean I approve of that statement, right? Well, that's what Paul was doing in chapter 6. He said, all things are permissible in quotes. He's not actually agreeing with that statement. He's saying, this is what the culture says, that everything's permissible. You can do whatever you want. Well, he actually responds to that in chapter 6 saying that's actually not true. Not all things are beneficial. And so here he's quoting what they had said to him, and then he's going to spend the rest of chapter 7, or at least a good portion of it, addressing this concept, this question, or this statement that is being said. Now, think about this for a minute. He's dealing with all kinds of sexual confusion, sexual promiscuity, all kinds of just outside of God's design. Sex being just practiced and done with prostitutes and not in marriage, and homosexuality and all kinds of prostitutes. All this stuff is happening in the Corinth culture. So Paul he knows this is taking place, and it's probable that what has happened is because of that, there's been a response within the church saying, hey, basically, like, look, if there's this many problems with sex, then let's just say that it's better for a man not to have sex with a woman, right? Absolute celibacy. That's the way to go. Sex is bad. It's a necessary evil. The truly holy Jesus people are no sex people. That's kind of what he's addressing here. There's some in the church that are saying this. So Paul, in this chapter, he's going to talk about how singleness, celibacy, and marriage are both gifts. They're both gifts. God has a plan for both of them. So it's not, don't go to one extreme or the other. It's not that one is better than the other. It's that both of these things are gifts from God, and he's going to unpack that. So just kind of remember this, keep this in mind. Christianity and the Bible has an incredibly high view of both singleness and marriage. It's both. It's both. It's not one or the other. But here's our dilemma. I think in 2025, especially in our culture, especially even our church culture, is obsessed with marriage. If anything, we've actually elevated marriage above singleness. And I'm going to show you that here in a moment. We've kind of almost, maybe not outright said it, but what we've implied that the goal for everybody, the goal is to get married. That's kind of like varsity. And if you don't get married, something's gone wrong and you're stuck on the junior varsity squad. And so what happens a lot of times in the life of the church is that single people often feel very marginalized. I know of one church that called its adult social group Pairs and Spares. And, oh, that's cute and clever. But think about that for a moment, that single people are just spares. That's terrible, really. We live in a church culture that kind of elevates marriage and marginalizes those who are single. And then on the other side of that, we live in a secular culture that's obsessed with singleness. Not biblical singleness, right? Which remains celibate, but a no commitment singleness where you can have sex whenever it's convenient for you with no strings, no commitment, nothing attached. And so in our culture at large, our secular culture, since 1960, the percentage of adults in our country who are married has dropped from 72% to right at 50%. And every year in our society, the average age for a first marriage goes up. Right now, it's about 30 for men and 28 for women. Well, Paul wants to show us here in chapter 7 God's plan for both marriage and singleness. And he begins by championing the goodness of sex within marriage. Look at verse 2. He says, "But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband." Translation: sex is a good desire. It's a God-given desire. And through it, God gives some beautiful illustrations of the gospel. We talked about this last week in chapter 6. And it's his way of multiplying humanity on earth. So he created marriage for that relationship. He says in verse 3, "The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband." Verse 4, "For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does." Now stop right there for a moment. In the Corinthian culture, that verse would have made total sense to the average Corinthian man. Right? It was, in their culture, it was just assumed that the wife was the man's servant to fulfill his desire. So they would have read that and gone, makes sense. Yeah, this is the way it's supposed to be. But look, that's not where Paul stops. He goes on at the end of verse 4 and he says, "Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does." Paul throws a curveball right into the middle of this culture. He says, "Corinthian men, you understand it culturally that the wife is to be your servant, but I'm actually saying you're also likewise to be her servant." He's saying in the same way, a husband does not have the right over his own body, but the wife does. This would have actually blown their minds. Corinthian men held all the cards in marriage. They had mastery over their wives. They could divorce her for any reason whatsoever. And all of a sudden, Paul inserts in here, hey, husbands, you should see yourself as her servant as well. Paul is actually overturning their entire system. In marriage, they are both to serve one another. And by the way, sometimes verses like this in our culture get pulled out of context like they are some kind of trump card that one spouse can play whenever they want. Hey, I'm ready, right? Tonight's the night, and Paul says, I have authority over your body, so you can't say no without sinning, right? This happens. This happens in our culture, even in church culture. But that's not what Paul is saying here, right? The sexual relationship between a husband and wife is way more complicated than that. He's simply saying that in marriage, both partners, the husband and wife, should see themselves as a servant of the other. Their goal should be to serve one another. This isn't a trump card that we pull out and play and try to use the Bible to get what we want. No, it's to say, hey, both of us are to come into our relationship with one another with an attitude of serving each other and being the one to bless and give to the other. So he says in verse 5, he says, do not deprive one another except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of control. Verse 6, now as a concession, not a command, I say this, I wish that all were as I myself am. Well, what is he? Well, he's single, right? So he's referring to his singleness here. He says, as a concession, not as a command, I say this, I wish that all of you were as I myself am. But each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. The word he uses there in verse 7, gift, it's the word charisma. It's the same word, and we're going to get into this later on in 1 Corinthians. It's the same word that he uses for spiritual gift. So Paul says marriage is good and it's a gift. He says, but I'm single and it's also a gift. He says, I actually wish more of you had this gift, the gift of singleness. Well, wait a minute. Paul, isn't it necessary to find that special someone in order to feel fully alive and experience this life? And Paul says, actually, no. He says, in fact, the most fulfilled person ever to walk the face of the earth was a 33-year-old single man who remained sexually celibate all of his life. So Paul says, no, actually, they're both a gift. And it's not one or the other. Each to each one, the gift is different. Look at verse 8. He says, to the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. So one thing that I want to point out here is that when Paul talks about singleness, I think sometimes we kind of lump that into one category as like, hey, this is this call to celibacy and singleness for life. And I don't think that's actually what Paul is doing here. Because he even lists right there, right? He says to the unmarried and the widows. So these are those who have been married, but their spouse has passed away. He's talking to people who are single for whatever reason. Those who are single because the right person hasn't come along yet, to those who are single again, maybe because of divorce, they walked out on you, maybe because they passed away and you're a widow or a widow. He's saying for whatever reason you find yourself single, Paul says it is good for them to remain as I am. So let me give you just really quickly tonight a handful of completely countercultural statements on sex and singleness gleaned from this chapter. Number one is this: singleness is not an inferior state to marriage. Singleness is not an inferior state to marriage. I know that like in our church context and culture, and even culturally, like most people are married, especially in Newcastle, America. It definitely is the majority here. But so there may not be a lot of single folks in the room, but there may be some of you that are here. Single people sometimes get a raw deal, and married people in the church are always trying to fix them up as if something was wrong with them, right? I've been guilty of this. I have. I had a pastor friend who was single actually into his 30s. And he said he always got tired of the little old ladies at his church who would say to him at each wedding, "Don't worry, you're next," right? And jokingly, I think, he said he'd go up to the same little old ladies at funerals and say, "Don't worry, you're next," but anyway. But like we sometimes, and it's not ill intent, but sometimes we treat those who are single as if there's something wrong, like they just haven't arrived yet. Don't worry, it's coming for you. And what Paul is saying is, whether you're called to that for your life or it's just a season, that's actually a gift from the Lord. Sometimes we talk like the reason single people are single is because they're not mature enough yet for marriage. I know that's not true. You know why I know that's not true? Because some of the most messed up, immature, dysfunctional people I know are married. Amen? Yeah, I mean, that's not true. It's not true that people are always single because they're not mature enough or ready for marriage. We'll say things like this: well, as soon as you're satisfied in God alone, then God will bring along someone special into your life. As if we earn God's blessings by achieving some spiritual Jedi state. No, that's not true. Or, well, God he needs to do a little bit of work on you before he brings you that someone special. You have to become someone wonderful before God gives you someone wonderful, as though God grants marriage as a reward to the satisfactorily sanctified. But that's not true. Tim Keller says all of these statements, under all of these kinds of statements, is the premise that a single life is a second-class life, a state of deprivation for people not yet fully formed for marriage. And those statements are not true. And that's because marriage is not some superior state to singleness. Jump down to verse 29 of chapter 7 and look what Paul says. He says, "This is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none." Sometimes people will read this verse and they'll be like, "See? I mean, I'm supposed to live like I'm single even though I'm married." What in the world? Is Paul telling men with wives that they don't have to live like they have one? Is that what Paul's saying? I mean, like, that's the patron verse of people going to Vegas. Like, let's live like we have no wives. No, that's not what he means. He explains in verse 31. He says, "And those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it, for the present form of this world is passing away." The present form of this world is passing away, and along with it, marriage, which is just a temporary gift. So both married people, this is what Paul's saying, both married people and single people should realize that their situation is not ultimate. It's not ultimate. Both marriage and singleness are temporary gifts for what? For the fulfillment of God's purposes. So throughout the Gospels, you study Jesus' teaching. Jesus said some really fascinating things about marriage. Once in the Gospel of Mark, he was asked this really complicated question about marriage. There was a woman who had 7 husbands because each husband had died. And so they came to Jesus and they said, "Jesus, in heaven, whose wife will she be?" Right? I mean, she had 7 in this life. I mean, is it going to be the last one she had? Is it going to be the first one she had? Whose wife will she be in heaven? Well, Jesus cuts them off. This is Mark chapter 12, verse 25. You can go look at it later. Jesus cuts them off and he says, well, actually, you're wrong on your premise because there's no marriage in heaven. That's his answer. There's no marriage in heaven. Marriage is a temporary illustration of the love of God. It's a temporary means by which God populated the earth. It is a good gift, but soon it will give way to the relationship to which it pointed, the relationship of Christ and his bride, his people. So a few chapters before that encounter, Jesus had been teaching and somebody called out to him and said, "Jesus, your mother and brothers are here to see you." And Jesus looked around at those around him and he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and my sister and my mother." Which means that relationships in the church are actually more binding than biological ones. I mean, like, how cool is it to be blood related to Jesus? We are his brothers and his sisters. We are his bride. I love how John Piper says it. He said, God promises you blessings in the age to come that are better than the blessings of marriage and children. Marriage is temporary, but what it stands for lasts forever. Marriage is a temporary institution that finally gives way to the relationship to which it was pointing all along, Christ and the church. At which point, marriage fades away. It becomes unnecessary. In the same way that you no longer need a picture of someone when you're standing face to face with them, that's what marriage is. It's a picture of our relationship. And so when our relationship with Christ is consummated, is fulfilled in eternity in heaven, marriage is no longer needed because it was to point us to the relationship of Christ and his church. At its best, marriage and sex are like gateway drugs that point us to a far more fulfilling relationship. So again, back to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 29, he says, the appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none, for the present form of this world is passing away. He's saying, whether married or single, we should realize that our situation is not the end. It's not ultimate. Both of those things, marriage and singleness, both of them are temporary gifts for the fulfillment of God's purposes. So we have to keep that in mind. Neither is inferior to the other. Second thing, the gifts of marriage and singleness both have their advantages. So marriage is a gift. We know that. To state the obvious, it is God who looked at man in the garden by himself and said, it's not good for man to be alone. So I'll make a helper fit for him. And the book of Genesis then goes on to recount how God fashioned woman. And the first word used to describe her was Edzer Kenegdo, which in Hebrew basically means same but different. Same but different. She was made in the image of God, just like him, same. But she was made different from him, complementary to him. So even though every person is an individual, there are general patterns to men and women that go back to how they were created. Make sure that you note I said general patterns, right? This isn't always true, but it's generally true. Most women are more nurturing and thus better at creating a stable home environment. Like many guys, I was not good at creating any kind of home environment. For most guys, their dream pad includes a waterbed, a black leather couch, and a TV with a PlayStation 5 and surround sound, right? And that's all you need. Before I got married, I could move out of my house and into another, and all it took was an El Camino, a few bungee cords, and about 15 minutes, right? Now it would take a full-size SUV just to haul the pillows that sit on top of my bed, and another to haul just the toiletry products in our shower. I look around the bathroom and I think, what is all this stuff, right? Who knew there were so many different kinds of soaps? My bathroom used to have one bar of soap, and I cleaned everything with it, my face, my hair, the floors, everything, right? Now again, not everybody's like that, but God made man and woman complementary so that the two of them together would be a more complete reflection of the image of God than would one gender be alone. And so bringing these two complementary pairs together in marriage is a gift. It is a gift. Even more importantly, marriage is a gift because it teaches us experientially about the love of God. We talked about that last week in chapter 6. The great theologian C.S. Lewis compared it to a ray of the sun, a ray which warms our face and makes us look back up along the ray to the God from whom it emanates. Now I'll tell you, my marriage has taught me more about the gospel than probably anything else in my life. The kindness, tenderness, forgiveness, security, unconditional love, all doctrines that I learned in seminary, but I actually got to experience them in marriage. So marriage is a gift, but singleness is also a gift. You say, well, how so? Well, Paul explains in verse 33 of chapter 7. Look at what he says. He says, but the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious. I skipped the verse. The unmarried and betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. What he's saying here, and when he says worldly here, he's not referring to like worldly in the sense of sinful, carnal. He's saying it in the sense of earthly concerns, earthly responsibilities. A healthy marriage, those of you who are married in the room, you know this, it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of effort. Sometimes you stay up late working things out. Husbands, your wife needs time. Wives, your husband needs your time. Your children need your time. As a married man, I'm not able to go on all the mission trips that I want to go on or that I used to go on when I was single. I can't do that anymore. I've got little people to run to soccer practice and help them do homework and help them get ready for bed. I'm guzzling 5-hour energy drinks on the way home from work because I know my real work's about to start, right? There's earthly responsibilities and concerns that you have to tend to. You know, people ask me, what are your hobbies, Pastor Nathan? And I say, do you mean what did they used to be, right? My hobbies are named Hadley and Kai and Adeline. It puts a demand on your time. Marriage puts a lot of demand on your money. I have people that I have to take care of. I want to bless and take care of them. You know, being married and having a family is expensive. Jenna and I will sometimes call our kids Tesla, Hawaii vacation, and beach house because that's what they cost us, right? Having a family limits my giving and generosity, what I can give to the Lord and the works of the Lord. The sacrifice of my time and my money, it's limited, divinely limited because of the responsibility God gave me to my wife and to my children. And I'm not saying that as a negative thing. I'm just saying that's reality, right? It's not just limiting, though, for the man. Paul says for the women. In verse 34, I read it. The unmarried, the betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about those worldly things, those earthly concerns, how to please her husband. So if you get married and you have children, it affects your career. It affects your life. Sometimes it affects where you can live and where you can go. And so it does do all those things. There's freedom of a single person to pursue certain things that's astounding, that a married person doesn't have. And so it's not, again, one or the other. It's that there's advantages to both. Advantages to both. You know, some of the best volunteers are single women. In fact, the International Mission Board says that 3 out of 4 applicants to go to the most unreached places on the planet, you know who they are? Single women. 3 out of 4 of the applicants that are applying to go to the most unreached places are single women. Paul is saying that one of the reasons that this is true is because singleness can be a gift that can free you up for mission and for doing something that a married person couldn't do for the sake of the kingdom. So it's no wonder that Paul says in verse 7 that we read just a little bit earlier, I wish that all people were as I am, because there would be so much extra bandwidth for the church, for ministry. So there's advantages to both, and I want us to see those, right? It's not one or the other. That's one of the things from this text. Third thing is this. So you know, and some of you in the room, maybe you're in this. Many of you have been married for a long time. But one of the questions that comes up in chapter 7 is this: well, like, should I get married? Like, should I pursue singleness? Should I pursue marriage? How does someone know if I should do this or that? That's the $1 million question, right? When you read chapter 7. Well, how do you know if you have the gift of marriage or if you have the gift of singleness? Well, first, realize that most people have a wrong conception of spiritual gifts. I kind of alluded to this already, but most people assume that a spiritual gift is some kind of lifelong assignment that God stamps you with when you leave heaven, like a personality trait. Like it's like, You get the gift and it's yours forever, and you're going to have it forever and you're going to exercise it forever. Well, spiritual gifts actually don't work like that. I mean, it's possible that that's the case, that it's yours and given to you forever. But the gift of singleness and marriage are definitely not like that. Because how many of you have been married your entire life? We've all been single at some point, right? So all of us at one point in time had the gift of singleness from the Lord. I'm going to show you this more when we study chapter 12 in 1 Corinthians, but a spiritual gift, a charisma, that word for gift, is a special empowerment that comes on you for a time for some spiritual assignment. Now that may be a long extended, that may be the rest of your life, but it may not be as well. Now all of us are or were single for a time, which means all of us for a time have the gift of singleness, and God will give the spiritual empowerment to do singleness well. You don't look within and mystically see if you've got the gift of singleness. I think we make this complicated. If you're single right now, you have the gift of singleness. It's that simple. If you're married right now, you have the gift of marriage. For at least the moment. Well, how do I know? Well, because you're single. And God's going to empower you to do it well. And if you're married, you have the gift of marriage. And you can know that because you're married. Even if you felt like it was a mistake, well, you have the gift now. And God will give you the spiritual power to do it well. You say, well, I'm single now, but wondering if marriage is a gift God is planning to give me in the future. How can I tell? Well, Paul gives a clue in verse 9. Go back to verse 9 in chapter 7. He says, but if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Paul says, if you pray about it, your desires to be married burn inside of you, it's perfectly okay to ask God for a spouse to meet those needs. But it could be that in praying about it, God answers your prayer by giving you the ability to control yourself without marriage. Or he might take away the desire to be married. Or have another desire grow stronger in your heart. Right? So I can't give you a firm answer on that other than to say that if that desire is there, that it may be that God does have that gift of marriage down the road for you. I had a friend who way back in the day prayed about getting married because she thought that's what good Christian girls do, right? Just pray and keep praying that God would provide a spouse for her. And the more that she prayed, the less desire she had to actually get married, and the more her passion for missions grew. God ended up taking her to the mission field, and she serves to this day. And she kind of always felt guilty about that, like there was something wrong with her. But then she read this passage, this chapter, and realized that actually, no, that was from the Lord. And she said it felt like such a relief to her to realize that God took that desire away because he had this gift and this greater passion in her to live her life on the mission field as a single woman. You know, Paul, who had the gift of singleness, he describes himself like this. Look at verse 37. Look at verse 37. He says, but whoever is firmly established in his heart, being under no necessity, but having his desire under control, and has determined this in his heart to keep her as his betrothed, he will do well. He says, firmly established in the heart, right? Paul's like, this isn't mystical. He says, this is really between you and God. He says in verse 36, if anyone feels that he should marry, if anyone thinks he's not behaving properly towards his betrothed, if his passions are strong, and it has to be, let him do as he wishes, right? He said, this isn't difficult. If the desire is there and you desire for marriage, let him marry. It's not a sin. He says, but whoever is firmly established in his heart, if it's there to not marry, then he shouldn't. Look at verse 39. He says, a wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she's free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. Yet in my judgment, she is happier if she remains as she is, and I think that I too have the Spirit of God. Translation is this. Paul says, don't make this hard. Pray about it and let God lead you through your desires, and trust that where he leads you, he will gift and empower you. He will gift him. So that's the best help I can give you. Should I marry? Should I not marry? It's pretty clear. Paul says, don't overcomplicate it. If the desire in your heart is there, seek the Lord, and if those desires continue, then do what you wish. If not, those desires begin to change, trust where he's leading, and he's going to give you either the gift of singleness or marriage, and he will empower you to walk in that gift. The other question is that comes up in this text, right? So people, should I marry? Should I not marry? Which is better? Well, they both have their advantages. They're both a gift from God. The second question, though, is, well, when do you know that it's the right time? How do you know you're ready for that? There's an interesting verse in this chapter, I think, that confuses people, but when you understand it in its context, it actually really makes sense. And that's verse 26. He says, I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. Well, what does that mean? He goes on and says, if you're married, stay married. If you're single, remain single. And so at first it sounds like Paul is telling single people, don't even seek marriage. Don't even seek to get married. But that's not what Paul's saying. Because he says, in view of this present distress, remain as you are. We have to understand that Paul was writing this letter in a particular era of history where persecution against Christians was at a fever pitch. Christian families were being torn apart and sold into slavery. And so he's saying it's difficult to go through persecution as a single person. He says, but when you're married, your worldly troubles multiply. So Paul is basically saying this, that present distress, what he's referring to, he's saying, in light of all of this persecution, now's not a great time to get married and have kids. But that was then, and that was what was happening to the Corinthian church. Currently, in Newcastle, America, we're not in a particularly persecuted moment. And so I believe actually in this context, Paul might encourage marriage more than he did in that one. But here's what I think the application is for us. Here's what it means for us. And this is, we've all probably given this wisdom to our children, our grandchildren, to those we know who are considering marriage. There are situations, eras, seasons, times in your life that it might be more advantageous to wait to get married, right? We've all considered that, talked to that, said that. For example, maybe you're in a season where you're trying to finish your education and get established in your career, or maybe God has called to a specific time of mission, a specific mission assignment. Or maybe you have been harmed by something and you need time to heal from something. Well, it might be that in those present situations, it would be wise to maybe wait. Well, what Paul's saying is, even in those situations, you can trust God that he'll give you the spiritual gifting to wait. One of the reasons to be closely involved in the life of a church is so that other people can help you see when those times are, to give wisdom to know, like Paul is saying, hey, maybe in this present situation in your life, it's not the right time. The last thing that I would say just from this text is this. And again, I know that most of us are married in this room, but maybe for those who aren't, and as we help our children and those who are thinking through these kinds of things, the last thing that I would say is never settle. Never settle. Look at verse 39. He said, a wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she's free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. If you get married, you should only do it in the Lord. Translation, you cannot and should not marry a non-Christian. So you should not date a non-Christian. Why on earth would you lead each other on when it literally can't work out? It's kind of cruel. Our spouses are the biggest influences on our lives. They're the biggest influences on our children. So we should never settle for a man or a woman who's not walking with God, who's not spiritually alive. Any one of you in this room that's married, I know we would all amen this, right? It is far better to be single than to be married to someone who doesn't share your core commitments. Amen? right? It is far better to be single. It's far better to never marry than to marry someone who's not a believer or someone who doesn't share the same core commitments. And so maybe there might be somebody in the room tonight who's not a believer. I don't know. If you're sitting here and you're not a Christian, you might be like, well, that's kind of mean, right? You're saying that people shouldn't marry me. You're saying I'm not good enough for them. Well, that's not what I'm saying. I'm telling you what the scripture teaches. And for your own sake, if you're not a Christian and you have no intention of becoming one, why would you want to marry a Christian? Because if you're dating a Christian and thinking about marrying them, guess what? They want to convert you. They want you to come to Christ. That's what they're after. That's why they probably encourage you to come to church and want you to come and hear the gospel. In fact, if you're a non-believer here and you're dating a Christian, their whole family is probably praying for you, and they're praying that you would come to know Christ. Their mom and dad's probably fasting and hoping that you'll become a Christian. And nobody in the family is ever going to be happy until you become one. So why would you want that, right? You want to be aligned with the person that you're in. So don't ever settle. So let me bring this back kind of to where I started. Marriage and singleness are what? They're both gifts from the Lord. Temporary gifts for the fulfillment of God's purposes in your life. So if you're looking for something to satisfy the deep needs of your soul, it's not going to be found in marriage. It's not going to be found in a new marriage. You're not going to find it in just being single and just pursuing the things that you're passionate about. You're only going to find it in Jesus and his love for you. That's the only place you'll find it. Yes, marriage is a gift. Yes, singleness is a gift, but you will not find satisfaction for the deepest need of your soul apart from a relationship with Christ. No, you're not created to be alone. God created you for relationship and for companionship. The ultimate place you find that is in relationship with him. And then you find that in a body of fellow believers that you do life with. Remember the statement from John Piper, marriage is temporary, but what it stands for lasts forever, Christ and the church, at which point marriage fades away. It becomes unnecessary the way you no longer need a picture of someone when you finally see them face to face. So I think it's a couple of practical takeaways for us tonight from chapter 7. Is one, let's be careful not to elevate one of these gifts over the other. The other thing is, one of the things that we're seeing in the life of our church as we continue to grow and more people come to First Baptist Newcastle is we're continuing to see more and more single people that come and are a part. And I'll tell you that one of the things that I hear often from them is, man, I often feel out of place. I don't feel like there's a place for me. So for those of us, especially those of us who are married, who have families, be on the lookout. I mean, this is true just across the board for anybody that's new to our church. Be on the lookout for people. Be on the lookout for people who don't have a place. I think about just inviting them over for lunch or going to lunch after on a Sunday. I think about holidays, especially single people who are in our area that don't have family. Maybe they've moved from somewhere else. We need to be thinking about that, mindful of that, and providing a place for them to not feel like they're a second-class citizen in the life of the church, but this is a place that they're wanted, needed, and God has gifted them for a special place to serve in his kingdom. And so I think there's so much wisdom here, so much more that I could say here. But let's see both marriage and singleness as the treasure that Paul describes them as. Let's not see it as a project to fix or anything like that at all. Now, let's be aware of these specific giftings in those around us lives. Let's be aware of the particular challenges. And let's invite, especially those who are single, into our families to experience relationship there. Invite them into key moments, not just to come over and babysit your kids or help you move, by the way, right? And all of the singles said amen if there's any in here. But actually into our lives, into relationship, into the life of the church.